What if your greatest sin in this dark world was simply being pure, gentle, and innocent? Welcome to Miro's library. Tonight, we step together into the cold mist of the Victorian English countryside, a place where a young girl named Tess sought neither ancient glory nor forgotten noble blood. She only searched for a quiet life, a little peace, and a shred of human dignity. Yet, cruel fate had already woven a golden trap around her path. The harsh society wrapped her in silence and unfair shame, while granting full mercy and easy pardon to the very men who broke her. Listen closely as we wander into one of the most tragic stories in all of classical literature, a deep, sorrowful journey of a woman who carried the heavy burdens of her past, endured the cold hypocrisy of modern love, and walked with quiet steps toward her inevitable fate. This is the story of Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Chapter 1. The Shadow of an Ancient Name. On an evening late in May, an elderly peddler named John D'Urberville was slowly walking home toward the quiet village of Marlott. The sun was going down behind the green hills of Blackamoor Vale, casting long, tired shadows upon the dusty road. John was not a strong man. His legs were weak, his pockets were empty, and his breath was heavy. Along the quiet lane, he met an old parson, riding upon a slow, gentle pony. John nodded politely, but the parson looked at him with a strange, knowing smile, and greeted him by a peculiar name. "Good night, Sir John." The poor peddler stopped, blinked with confusion, and leaned upon his wooden staff. He had lived his entire life as a humble, struggling man, carrying basic goods, from cottage to cottage, barely earning enough bread to feed his large, hungry family. He asked the parson, with genuine wonder, why he had called him by such a grand, noble title. The clergyman explained, in a calm, clear voice, that he was an amateur historian who loved to study the old family trees of Wessex. He revealed a shocking, forgotten truth. John D'Urberville was not merely a poor country hawker, but the direct lineal descendant of the ancient, aristocratic knights of the noble house of D'Urberville. Centuries ago, his grand ancestors were powerful lords who came over with William the Conqueror, owning vast lands, grand stone castles, and immense wealth. But today, the parson noted with a sigh, all that magnificent glory had vanished into dust, leaving only an empty name and silent stone tombs in the dark vaults of Kingsbere Church. Meanwhile, in the green meadows of Marlott, the young village maidens were gathering for the annual May Day dance. Among them stood John's eldest daughter, Tess. She was a fresh, innocent girl, barely passing from girlhood into early womanhood. She had large, dark, expressive eyes, soft lips, and thick brown hair that fell gently over her shoulders. She wore a simple, pure white dress, with a red ribbon tied neatly in her dark hair, glowing with natural youth, untouched by the sorrows of the cruel outside world. As she laughed and danced, under the soft evening light, 3 young brothers, who were traveling gentlemen, paused near the gate to observe the pastoral scene. The youngest brother, a quiet, thoughtful student named Angel Clare, stepped into the circle to dance with one of the village girls. He was in a hurry, eager to catch up with his companions, and left the field quickly. Yet, as he reached the far gate, his eyes met those of young Tess. She stood still, watching him walk away, feeling a sudden, strange emptiness. Deep within her heart, Angel felt a sudden pang of quiet regret that he had not chosen her, the prettiest and most striking girl of all, for the dance. Later that night, the fragile peace of the D'Urberville cottage was shattered by noise and foolish celebration. John returned home, entirely overwhelmed by the grand illusion of his aristocratic blood. spending his last remaining coins on drink at the local tavern, dreaming of impossible fortunes. The family horse, Prince, was old, weak, and tired. Because her father was too unwell to make the midnight journey, Tess took the wagon, deep into the dark, silent night, to deliver the heavy beehives to a distant market. She sat alone, driving under the cold, distant stars, fighting against heavy exhaustion. Her weary eyes slowly closed. Her hands softened upon the reins, and sleep stole over her. In the pitch-black silence of the lonely country road, suddenly, a violent, deafening crash tore through the darkness. The speeding morning mail coach, with its heavy iron-tipped shaft, smashed straight into the chest of poor Prince. Tess awoke in absolute terror, surrounded by blood, dust, and darkness. She stood beside the dying horse, watching its breath fade into the cold morning air. Her hands and white dress stained with crimson blood. The family's only means of earning bread was completely gone. Overwhelmed by agonizing guilt and a deep, burning sense of responsibility, Tess looked up at the gray sky, realizing that her innocent, peaceful childhood was lost forever. In that single, tragic moment. Chapter 2. The Trap at the Slopes. The Death of the Poor Horse. Prince hung like a dark, suffocating cloud over the humble Derbyfield home. The children were crying for bread and warmth, while John sat in bitter silence, his grand dreams of noble heritage turning into cold despair. Tess walked through the small rooms, with heavy steps, carrying a silent, crushing burden of guilt deep inside her fragile heart. Her ambitious mother, Joan, saw an immediate opportunity in this terrible family disaster. She remembered hearing of a wealthy lady named d'Urberville, who lived in a grand, modern estate called the Slopes, near the distant town of Joan convinced herself and her reluctant husband that this rich lady must be a close, powerful relation. She insisted, with eager words, that young Tess must travel there, claim their forgotten kinship, and beg for a respectable, comfortable employment to save her starving family from ruin. Tess resisted, with tears and trembling protests, feeling an instinctive dread of claiming relations with wealthy strangers. But every time her dark eyes fell upon the empty stable and the hungry, innocent faces of her little siblings, her resolve broke down. Reluctantly, she agreed to go, putting on her finest, simple country gown. Her mother tied her dark hair carefully, admiring her youthful grace, whispering reckless hopes of a grand gentleman falling in love with their beautiful, dutiful daughter. After a long, weary journey through unfamiliar woods, Tess finally arrived at the magnificent gates of the Slopes. The estate was modern, bright, and lavish, completely detached from ancient mossy antiquity. In truth, the family living there were originally named Stoke, wealthy northern merchants, who had simply bought the grand, extinct name of d'Urberville, along with their great fortune, to gain false social status and aristocratic prestige. As Tess walked nervously along the paved garden paths, a tall, handsome young man appeared, stepping out from behind the crimson rosebush. His name was Alec d'Urberville. He had sharp, bold features, dark curling hair, a thick, dark mustache with curled points, and bright, piercing eyes that immediately fixed upon Tess with intense, predatory interest. He listened to her soft, humble explanation of kinship with an amused, cunning smile, mocking her foolish father's claims, yet captivated by her fresh, country beauty. Alec gave her no promises regarding the blind old mistress of the house, but he showered her with ripe, red strawberries, forcing them playfully into her hesitant, blushing lips. Tess accepted the sweet fruit, feeling uneasy and profoundly disturbed by his bold, possessive gaze. A few days later, a formal letter arrived, at the cottage in the wealthy Mrs. d'Urberville offered Tess a steady, well-paid position, managing the valuable poultry farm on the estate, against her own quiet intuition. But pressed by her family's desperate need, Tess returned to Alec was waiting everywhere she went, watching her every movement, offering lavish gifts, and speaking sweet, dangerous words of affection, which only filled her with cold fear and deep mistrust. Weeks passed, in tension and unease, until the fateful night of the country dance. In the neighboring village of Chase, the drunken, jealous village girls mocked Tess for her pride and her beauty, cornering her in the dark, hostile street. Suddenly, the pounding hooves of a horse broke the tense standoff. Alec appeared, emerging from the dark fog, offering her a swift, safe escape from the angry mob. Joan convinced herself and her reluctant husband that this rich lady must be a close, powerful relation. She insisted, with eager words, that young Tess must travel there, claim their forgotten kinship, and beg for a respectable, comfortable employment to save her starving family from ruin. Tess resisted, with tears and trembling protests, feeling an instinctive dread of claiming relations with wealthy strangers. But every time her dark eyes fell upon the empty stable and the hungry, innocent faces of her little siblings, her resolve broke down. Reluctantly, she agreed to go, putting on her finest, simple country gown. Her mother tied her dark hair carefully, admiring her youthful grace, whispering reckless hopes of a grand gentleman falling in love with their beautiful, dutiful daughter. After a long, weary journey through unfamiliar woods, Tess finally arrived at the magnificent gates of the slopes. The estate was modern, bright, and lavish, completely detached from ancient mossy antiquity. In truth, the family living there were originally named Stoke, wealthy northern merchants who had simply bought the grand, extinct name of d'Urberville, along with their great fortune, to gain false social status and aristocratic prestige. As Tess walked nervously along the paved garden paths, a tall, handsome young man appeared, stepping out from behind the crimson rosebush. His name was Alec d'Urberville. He had sharp, bold features, dark curling hair, a thick, dark mustache with curled points, and bright, piercing eyes that immediately fixed upon Tess with intense, predatory interest. He listened to her soft, humble explanation of kinship with an amused, cunning smile, mocking her foolish father's claims, yet captivated by her fresh, country beauty. Alec gave her no promises regarding the blind old mistress of the house, but he showered her with ripe, red strawberries, forcing them playfully into her hesitant, blushing lips. Tess accepted the sweet fruit, feeling uneasy and profoundly disturbed by his bold, possessive gaze. A few days later, a formal letter arrived at the cottage in the wealthy Mrs. d'Urberville offered Tess a steady, well-paid position, managing the valuable poultry farm on the estate, against her own quiet intuition. But pressed by her family's desperate need, Tess returned to Alec was waiting everywhere she went, watching her every movement, offering lavish gifts, and speaking sweet, dangerous words of affection, which only filled her with cold fear and deep mistrust. Weeks passed, in tension and unease, until the fateful night of the country dance. In the neighboring village of Chase, the drunken, jealous village girls mocked Tess for her pride and her beauty, cornering her in the dark, hostile street. Suddenly, the pounding hooves of a horse broke the tense standoff. Alec appeared, emerging from the dark fog, offering her a swift, safe escape from the angry mob. Exhausted, terrified, and having no other choice, Tess mounted behind him, holding tightly to his waist. As the powerful horse plunged deep into the ancient, silent darkness of the primeval forest, known as the Chase. The night grew colder, thicker, and pitch black as they wandered, hopelessly lost. Beneath the towering ancient oak trees, Alex stopped the horse, confessing that he had deliberately taken the wrong path, trying to force a kiss and a surrender. From the frightened girl, Tess refused him, firmly, weeping in exhaustion, and trembling from the bitter, damp chill. Alec made a soft bed of dead leaves, wrapping her carefully in his heavy, warm coat, promising to leave her alone while he went to search for the forgotten roadway, surrounded by the deep, primeval silence of the ancient woods. Tess finally succumbed to absolute physical and mental exhaustion. Closing her weeping eyes in heavy, innocent sleep, Alec returned quietly through the dense fog, his boots making no sound upon the wet, mossy earth. He knelt beside her, sleeping, helpless form, gazing at her pure, unblemished face with relentless, selfish desire. Under the cold, indifferent stars, where no guardian angel intervened to protect her fragile innocence, a dark, irreversible tragedy unfolded, shattering her sacred youth and sealing her sorrowful destiny forever. Chapter 3. The Bitter Harvest of Sorrow. The morning mist hung low over the ancient trees of the Chase, cold, heavy, and gray. Tess awoke with a deep, silent horror in her aching heart, realizing that the gentle dawn of her innocence had died forever in the dark woods. She did not stay at the slopes, despite the honeyed words, expensive gifts, and empty promises of Alec. He offered her fine clothes, gold, and a comfortable life of sheltered luxury, but Tess looked upon him only with quiet hatred and profound disgust. She packed her humble wicker basket, gathered her modest belongings, and turned her back on the gilded prison of She walked all the long, dusty miles back toward her native valley, weeping quietly under the gray, indifferent sky, feeling like a hunted, wounded bird, seeking refuge in a nest that could never truly shelter her again. When she finally entered the familiar cottage in Marlot, she met not comfort, but bitter disappointment. Her mother, Joan, was furious, reproaching her harshly for not playing her cards well and failing to secure a wealthy marriage with the rich young gentleman. Tess looked at her mother with burning tears in her eyes, crying out in bitter agony that she had been sent into the cruel world, completely blind, naive, and having no knowledge of the treacherous snares and wolves in gentlemen's clothing that preyed upon innocent girls. She withdrew completely from the eyes of the village, hiding within the 4 dark walls of her small bedroom. She only went outside late at night, walking alone under the pale moon, feeling as though the silent trees, the nocturnal animals, and the cold stars above were all pointing fingers of shame and judging her unseen guilt. As the cold winter gave way to a quiet, fragile spring, a new life entered the sorrowful world. Tess gave birth, in the dim light of the cottage, to a weak, sickly infant boy. She loved the child with a wild, desperate, and aching tenderness, nursing him with her tears, naming him secretly in her heart, a living symbol of her immense pain and enduring love. But the baby's tiny breath was shallow, fluttering like a fading candle flame in a harsh, cold wind. One dark night, the infant grew violently ill, his tiny body burning with fever, his small chest struggling for every gasp of air. Tess was gripped by absolute, paralyzing terror, not just of death, but of eternal damnation, for her child had not yet received the holy sacrament of Christian baptism. She begged her father, with frantic tears, to run to the village church and bring the local parson to save the dying baby's soul. But John Derbyfield, blinded by stubborn pride and deep family shame, locked the cottage door, refusing to allow any clergyman to witness the quiet scandal of his house. Desperate, alone, and trembling with spiritual anguish, Tess realized that the sacred task fell upon her own hands. She placed a basin of cold, clear water beside her bed, gathered her frightened little brothers and sisters, and lit a single flickering candle in the dark, silent room. She stood tall, wrapped in a simple nightgown, her dark hair falling wild over her pale shoulders, glowing with a pure, divine maternal light. She dipped her fingers into the water, touched the cold forehead of her dying child, and spoke the solemn words. With trembling authority, "Sorrow, I baptize thee in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost." The little children whispered their soft amen, looking up at their sister as if she were an angel of mercy. Descending into the dark room, a few hours later, in the early light of morning, the tiny breath stopped, and baby Sorrow passed peacefully. Away into the great silence, Tess went to the village parson, begging him with a broken heart to grant her little Sorrow a Christian burial in the consecrated earth of the churchyard. The parson, bound by rigid dogma and social prejudice, refused to bury the unbaptized child in the holy ground. He only conceded, with cold pity, that her desperate baptism might suffice for God, but not for the rules of the church. With her own bare hands, in the dark corners of the night, Tess carried a small, unpainted pine box to the lonely, overgrown boundary of the church graveyard. She buried baby Sorrow in the neglected ground, reserved for drunkards, suicides, and outcasts. She planted a few wild, pale daisies upon the tiny mound, wept her final bitter tears of youth, and resolved to bury her broken past, seeking a distant, unknown land to begin her life anew. Chapter 4. The Green Haven of Talbothays. Nearly 3 long years had passed since the sorrowful death of little baby Sorrow, and the bitter memories had slowly settled, like cold ash, within Tess's quiet soul. The dark gossip of Marlott still whispered in the shadows, making her home valley feel like a suffocating cage. She felt a desperate, burning hunger for a new beginning, far away from familiar eyes and judging tongues. She heard of work down in the rich, lush valley of the River Froom, known far and wide as the Valley of the Great Dairy. On a bright, radiant morning, late in the month of May, Tess gathered her modest bundles and set forth, walking south toward her distant destination. As she crested the rolling ridge of hills, leaving her cold, narrow home valley behind, the vast southern landscape opened before her, like a magnificent emerald green paradise. The air was warmer, the soil was rich and dark, and the clear river wound gracefully through fertile water meadows, where hundreds of fat, healthy cattle grazed peacefully under the golden sunlight. It seemed to her like a fresh, unblemished Eden, where the dark past had no power and life could be reborn. She arrived at Talbothays Dairy, a bustling, prosperous farm, filled with the sweet, clean smells of fresh milk, warm hay, and rich yellow butter. The master dairyman, Richard Crick, was a generous, hearty man who welcomed her warmly into the busy household. Tess settled quickly into the steady, rhythmic labor of country life. Every morning, before the break of dawn, she walked out into the misty meadows, alongside the other dairy maidsies who, Reddy Priddle and Marian, carrying heavy wooden pails and singing joyful folk songs as they milked the docile cows. Her natural vitality and youthful glow returned. Her cheeks blushed with vibrant health, and her dark, expressive eyes sparkled once again with hope and innocent wonder. It was during these quiet, early morning hours that a familiar, thoughtful figure entered her daily world, a young man living at the dairy as an apprentice to learn the practical business of farming before emigrating abroad. His name was Angel Clare. He was the youngest son of an austere, pious parson from a strict, respectable family. Unlike his brothers, who studied for the church and embraced narrow Victorian dogmas, Angel was an idealistic thinker, a lover of classical philosophy, poetry, and radical independent thought. He had rejected the rigid priesthood, preferring a life of honest, noble labor, close to the pure, untamed earth. When Angel first noticed Tess in the soft, lavender light of dawn, sitting silently beside a great cow, her dark hair wrapped in a simple handkerchief, he saw her not merely as a humble milkmaid, but as a mythical, divine spirit of nature. He called her his Artemis, his Demeter, seeing in her uncorrupted simplicity the pure essence of genuine womanhood. Tess, for her part, remembered him instantly as the handsome, refined student who had glanced at her with quiet regret on the village green of Marlotte so many years ago. She looked up to him with immense reverence, awe, and deep admiration, listening eagerly. Whenever he played his sweet, melancholic harp in the quiet evenings by the garden window, her heart trembled with a profound, overwhelming love, far deeper and purer than anything she had ever known. Day after day, amidst the warm, humid air of the milking sheds and the endless sea of green grass, their souls drew closer together. One summer afternoon, during a sudden, torrential downpour, the river flooded the low lane, cutting off the dairymaids from the church path. Angel stepped boldly into the rising water, lifting each young woman in his strong arms to carry them safely across the rushing flood. When it was Tess's turn, he lifted her gently against his chest. They looked into each other's eyes, feeling the rapid, thundering beating of their hearts, the entire world vanishing around them in a moment of sheer, breathless ecstasy. Angel held her tighter, whispering that she was more precious and beautiful than all the rest. Tess trembled in his warm embrace, torn violently between absolute heaven and creeping terror. She knew, deep within her soul, that she loved this man with every fiber of her being. Yet, like a dark poisonous shadow, creeping across a blooming field of summer flowers, the memory of Alec Derber and her buried, unbaptized child returned to haunt her conscience. A cold, silent voice whispered in her ear that she had no right to this magnificent happiness, and that the truth of her past was a hidden, sleeping serpent waiting to strike them both. Chapter 5. The Shadow of Confession. The golden summer in the lush Froome Valley slowly gave way to a warm, lingering autumn filled with heavy harvests and ripe red apples. The love between Angel Claire and Tess grew deeper with every passing sunrise, burning with an intense, quiet flame that neither of them could extinguish. Angel could no longer conceal the burning devotion of his soul. One quiet, misty evening, while the cows were resting peacefully in the meadow, he took Tess by the hand, looked deeply into her dark, sorrowful eyes, and asked her to be his lawful wife. Instead of joyful tears, a wave of cold terror swept across Tess's pale face. She loved him with an almost divine adoration, worshipping the ground he walked upon, yet the dark shadow of her past rose like an impenetrable stone wall between their beating hearts. She pulled her hand away, trembling violently, and refused his noble proposal, telling him, with a broken, choked voice, that she was entirely unworthy of his refined love and that she could never, ever marry any man. Angel was completely baffled by her persistent refusal, believing her protests were born merely of humble country modesty, in fear of his high social standing. Over the following weeks, he pressed her again and again, with sweet, tender eloquence, describing a bright, idyllic future together, across the distant oceans, where they would build a prosperous, free life on a vast new farm. Tess fought an agonizing, silent war within the quiet chambers of her conscience. Every fiber of her being yearned to surrender to his warm embrace. Yet her unbending sense of honesty screamed at keeping her dark secret was a treacherous, unforgivable deceit. She decided to write a long, desperate letter to her mother, Joan Derby, begging for maternal guidance and wisdom. Her mother's swift reply was cold, pragmatic, and unyielding. She strictly commanded Tess never to utter a single syllable of her old trouble with Alec d'Urberville, warning her that revealing such forgotten ruin would only destroy her happiness and drive the handsome young gentleman away forever. Overwhelmed by her mother's stern warnings and worn down by Angel's constant, passionate entreaties, Tess finally broke down and whispered her tearful consent. The wedding was set for the cold, clear days of late December, yet, as the fateful day approached, the crushing weight of her hidden secret became utterly unbearable, suffocating her breathing and haunting her dreams. With visions of ruin and betrayal, determined to enter the holy bond with a pure, honest soul, Tess sat down late one evening by the dim candlelight of her attic room. With trembling fingers and ink stained by bitter tears, she wrote a full, unsparing confession, detailing every terrible moment of her seduction by Alec, the birth of baby sorrow, and the lonely grave. In the neglected corner of Marlott churchyard, she walked softly down the dark stairs, holding the folded letter against her pounding chest, and slipped it carefully beneath the wooden door of Angel's bedchamber. The next morning, Tess waited, with a dry throat and a pounding heart, fully expecting Angel to confront her with cold anger or bitter disgust. But when he emerged from his room, his face was radiant, his eyes were full of unclouded tenderness, and he kissed her forehead with the exact same gentle warmth as before. Tess felt an overwhelming rush of immense relief, believing in her innocent heart that this noble, enlightened philosopher had read her dark tragedy and forgiven her completely through the boundless power of his love. On New Year's Eve, the modest wedding took place in a small, quiet country church, as the iron carriage carried them away toward an old, decaying d'Urberville family manor at Wellbridge, where they were to spend their honeymoon. A sudden mournful omen chilled Tess's blood. An old country legend spoke of a phantom d'Urberville coach that appeared only to herald disaster, blood, and ruin. For the ancient line, upon arriving at the cold, drafty stone manor, Tess was assigned the master bedroom. As she bent down near the heavy oak door to adjust her wedding gown, her eyes fell upon a small white object lying silently beneath the woolen edge of the carpet. It was her sealed, unopened confession. It had slipped under the thick rug, completely untouched, unread, and unseen by Angel Clare. The cold realization struck her like a violent blow. Her beloved husband knew nothing of the dark truth. The grand illusion was still unbroken, and the terrible hour of honest judgment had merely been postponed to the dark, silent night ahead. Chapter 6. The Fire and the Ash. The winter evening fell swiftly, wrapping the ancient, drafty manor house of Wellbridge in a cold, impenetrable darkness. Outside, the wind howled through the bare trees, while inside the large room, a great log fire crackled and hissed, casting long, dancing shadows across the high stone walls. Upon those dark panels hung two old, sinister portraits of ancient d'Urberville ladies. Their painted faces looked down upon Tess with sharp, cruel features, sunken eyes, and haughty, mocking sneers, as though silently welcoming another ruined daughter of their blood into their cursed history. Angel and Tess sat together near the warm hearth, eating their first modest meal as husband and wife. The atmosphere was quiet, yet thick with unspoken emotions and lingering tension. Angel poured wine into 2 glasses. Looking deeply into Tess's pale, anxious face, he took her trembling hands into his own and confessed that he had a heavy, painful secret weighing upon his conscience, which he needed to lay bare before their new life could truly begin. He leaned forward, looking into the glowing embers of the fire, and admitted with genuine shame, that during his youthful years in London, he had lived for 48 reckless hours. In blind dissipation, in carnal sin with an unknown woman, he begged Tess, with bowed head, for her full, unreserved pardon, believing that this brief, shameful lapse in his past was a terrible stain upon his moral character. Tess felt an immediate, overwhelming wave of relief and boundless joy flooding her anxious heart. She smiled through her tears, embraced him tenderly, and forgave him instantly, without a second of hesitation. In her innocent mind, she truly believed that since he had fallen and sought mercy, he would naturally understand and forgive her own sorrowful past, which had been forced upon her against her pure will. Encouraged by his vulnerability, Tess knelt beside his chair, rested her head against his knee, and began to speak. In a quiet, trembling voice, punctuated by silent tears, she revealed the entire horrifying story, the manipulative traps of Alec d'Urberville, the dark violation in the primeval forest of the Chase, the bitter birth of her sickly infant boy, and the lonely, unhallowed grave of baby Sorrow. Beneath the wild daisies, she poured out her entire soul, holding nothing back, looking up into his face, expecting to find the warm, comforting light of unconditional love and mutual forgiveness. Instead, she met a gaze of absolute, frozen horror, the warm color completely drained from Angel's handsome face, leaving it as pale, rigid, and cold as a marble statue. He stood up abruptly, pulling his clothes away from her touch, as if her gentle hands were carrying a deadly plague. He walked across the room, staring blankly into the dark corner, his breathing coming in slow, shallow gasps. Tess crawled after him on the stone floor, weeping in bitter agony, clutching the hem of his coat, begging him to look at her, to remember that she was still the same Tess, the same devoted woman who loved him more than her own life. Angel looked down upon her with cold, pitiless eyes and uttered the devastating words that shattered her soul into pieces. The woman I have been loving is not you, but another woman in your shape whom you only resembled in that cruel, defining moment. The enlightened, radical philosopher vanished completely, revealing the rigid, unforgiving moralist beneath. He could forgive himself for intentional lust, yet he could never forgive her for being the unwilling victim of another man's violence. The fire slowly died down, leaving only cold, gray ash in the grate, mirroring the sudden catastrophic death of their sacred happiness. A few nights later, while Tess lay awake in sleepless despair, Angel walked into the room, his eyes open yet unseeing, trapped in a profound, walking sleep. He knelt beside her bed, lifted her gently in his strong arms, and carried her out of the manor, into the freezing, dark winter night. As he walked toward the swollen river, he wept bitter tears in his sleep, whispering brokenly, "Dead, dead, dead. My poor, ruined wife is dead." He laid her tenderly inside an ancient, lidless stone coffin of an old abbot, kissing her cold lips with a tragic, helpless passion before lying down beside the tomb. In the wet grass, Tess did not wake him, nor did she push him away. She would have gladly welcomed death in that cold stone embrace, if it meant dying in the arms of the only man she had ever loved. When morning came, Angel awoke to the harsh, unforgiving reality of his rigid convictions. He refused to live with her, declaring that they must part ways until he could conquer his profound disgust and find a way to reconcile his ideals with her stained reality. He divided his remaining money, gave her a small share, and sent her back toward her parents' cottage, while he made final preparations to sail far across the Atlantic Ocean to the wild, desolate lands of Brazil, leaving Tess behind, abandoned, broken, and utterly alone in the cold, merciless winter of Wessex. Chapter 7. The Cold Barrens of Flintcamash. After Angel boarded the grand ship for Brazil, A dark, desolate silence fell over Tess's broken life. She could not bear to remain in where her mother's sharp, bitter complaints and the curious eyes of gossiping neighbors pierced her wounded soul like sharp needles. She gave nearly all the money that angel had left her to her struggling family, to repair their leaking roof and buy food for her little siblings, leaving herself almost entirely penniless, determined to hide her shame and earn her own bread. Through the hardest, most punishing toil, she walked far away into the high, desolate uplands of Flint. Flint Gamache was the complete opposite of the green, fertile paradise of Talbot. It was a barren, starved plateau, where the soil was thin, hard, and choked with white, jagged flint stones. The winter winds swept across the open, treeless fields with savage, howling fury, biting into the flesh and freezing the blood. Here, the soft pastoral romance of farming vanished entirely, replaced by cold, mechanical cruelty and backbreaking, endless misery. Tess found shelter in a damp, decaying cottage, alongside her old dairy companion, Marion, and later, the faithful, gentle Hoot. Together, the women were forced to perform the most grueling field work, digging up frozen turnip roots from the iron-hard ground, with bleeding, cracked hands, from early dawn until the freezing gloom of nightfall. The harsh master of the farm was a cruel, unforgiving tyrant who demanded unrelenting speed, punishing every moment of rest with harsh threats and heavy fines. To make matters worse, a monstrous, smoke-belching, steam-threshing machine was brought to the farm. Tess was placed upon the high, shaking wooden platform, feeding the relentless, roaring beast with heavy bundles of corn. Hour after hour, without a single moment of pause, her body throbbed with agony. Her lungs were choked with dust, and the deafening noise of the iron gears rang like a dark funeral march in her weary ears. Yet, throughout all this punishing torment, her thoughts remained faithful only to Angel, whispering his name into the cold wind, clinging to the fragile, fading hope of his eventual return. One freezing Sunday, driven by desperate longing and near starvation, Tess decided to walk 15 long miles to the town of Ambient to seek out Angel's respectable parents. She hoped, with all her heart, that the pious Parson Clare and his kind wife might offer her some gentle advice or at least news of her absent husband. When she finally arrived at the vicarage, dusty, exhausted, and trembling with bitter cold, her courage completely failed her. She saw Angel's older brothers, two arrogant, cold-hearted clergymen, walking through the lane. As they passed her hidden spot, she overheard them mocking Angel's foolish, romantic choices, ridiculing the coarse country girl he had chosen to marry, stricken by profound humiliation, and believing herself entirely unworthy to knock upon the vicar's door. Tess turned around, with tears streaming down her hollow cheeks, and began the long, agonizing walk back to the desolate farm. On the lonely road back to passing through a small village, Tess noticed a crowd of country folk gathering around a barn to listen to an itinerant preacher. The voice coming from within the wooden building was booming, fierce, and full of terrifying hellfire rhetoric, shouting of eternal damnation, violent repentance, and holy redemption. Curious, Tess peered through the open doorway into the dim interior. The fiery preacher turned toward the light, raising his clenched fist, and the words died in Tess's throat. The man standing at the pulpit, shouting holy scriptures with manic, feverish intensity, was none other than Alec d'Urberville. The dark seducer had apparently converted under the influence of Angel's father, turning his unrestrained passions toward religious fanaticism. As Alec's sharp, dark eyes scanned the doorway, they fell upon Tess's pale, unforgettable face. The Bible dropped from his trembling hands. The fiery sermon froze upon his lips, and the wild, dangerous madness of his old obsession flared up again in an instant. Tess turned and fled down the dark road, hearing the heavy, pounding footsteps of her past, closing in behind her once more. Chapter 8. The Return of the Phantom. The sudden reappearance of Alec d'Urberville cast a suffocating, terrifying shadow over Tess's already shattered existence. His temporary mantle of religious piety and holy fervor dissolved rapidly under the heat of his rekindled obsession. Within days of spotting her at the barn, Alec abandoned his fiery preaching altogether. He tracked Tess down to the bleak, windswept fields of flint, appearing like a dark wraith beside the stone walls. Watching her relentlessly as she bent over the frozen earth, he approached her with desperate, shifting moods, one moment pleading for her forgiveness and begging her to save his wavering soul, and the next, mocking her absent husband with cruel, sharp sarcasm. He reminded her, with venomous truth, that Angel Claire had completely abandoned her to starve in the cold mud, while he, her first master, had the wealth, power, and desire to lift her and her impoverished family out of perpetual misery. Tess stood firm against him, her dark eyes flashing with pure defiance and deep loathing. She wrapped her torn woolen shawl tightly around her shaking shoulders, telling him to leave her in peace, stating firmly that she would rather starve on the barren rocks than touch a single coin of his tainted money. When Alec boldly grabbed her arm, trying to force his way into her personal space, Tess struck him across the face with her heavy leather work glove. The blow drew blood upon his lip, but Alec merely wiped it away with a sinister, mocking laugh, swearing that he was her true, natural master, and that he would eventually possess her again, whether she willed it or not. In her growing terror and isolation, Tess sat down on the cold floor of her damp cottage and wrote a long, heartbreaking letter to Angel in Brazil. She poured out her desperate soul onto the paper, weeping bitter tears over the ink, begging him to return and save her from the encroaching darkness before it was too late. I have done wrong, but oh my darling, have you not done wrong too? Come back to me, Angel, for I am entirely yours, and I am being hunted down like a wounded animal. Before any answer could arrive from across the vast ocean, a terrible message reached her from Marlotte. Both her parents were desperately ill, and her home was falling into ruin. Tess abandoned her grueling job at the farm and rushed back to her native village. She arrived just in time to nurse her mother through a severe fever, but her father, John d'Urberville, whose heart was weak and worn out by years of drink and empty, aristocratic delusions, collapsed and died suddenly in his bed. The death of John d'Urberville was the final, devastating blow to the family's fragile stability, because the old lease on their modest cottage depended entirely upon John's living name. The local landlord immediately issued a cold notice of eviction. The widowed mother, Tess, and the helpless young children were cast out into the dusty road, with all their poor furniture piled onto a borrowed wagon. They had nowhere to go, no roof to shelter them from the bitter rain, and no money to buy their daily bread. They traveled slowly to Kingsbere, the ancient resting place of the d'Urberville, hoping to find a humble room to rent near the church. But upon arriving, they found every lodging occupied and every door slammed in their desperate faces. In utter despair, the homeless family set up a makeshift bed against the exterior stone walls of Kingsbere Church, right beneath the grand, stained glass window that bore the ancient d'Urberville coat of arms. Tess walked into the dark, silent vaults of the ancient church, standing before the cold, carved stone tombs of her once mighty ancestors. She looked down at the silent marble knights, whispering in bitter, hollow agony, "Why am I on the wrong side of this stone?" Suddenly, from the deep shadows of the stone vaults, a familiar, well-dressed figure emerged. Alec d'Urberville stepped forward, leaning against the tomb of an ancient lord, smiling with quiet, triumphant malice. He looked at the starving, weeping family camped outside in the dirt, and then turned his piercing eyes upon Tess. He laid down his final, merciless ultimatum. He would provide a comfortable, warm home for her sick mother, pay for the education and care of all her little brothers and sisters, and rescue them from total destruction. If only Tess would surrender herself and come to live with him as his wife, surrounded by the cold, unanswering dust of the dead and the starving cries of the living. Tess felt the iron jaws of the golden trap snap shut upon her soul forever. Chapter 9. The Crimson Stain. Across the vast, roaring Atlantic Ocean, in the wild, untamed wilderness of Brazil, Angel Clare lay dying of a violent, burning tropical fever. His ambitious agricultural dreams had turned into a catastrophic failure. The harsh climate, bad water, and relentless sickness had decimated his companions and broken his once strong body. During those long, delirious nights of agony, a profound spiritual awakening tore through Angel's soul. He had met a wise dying stranger in the Brazilian jungle, a seasoned man of the world, who listened to Angel's rigid condemnation of his pure, loving wife. The stranger looked upon Angel with deep, sorrowful pity, telling him that true morality lay not in rigid social codes or technical physical purity, but in the genuine intentions and enduring nobility of the human soul. The scales of narrow Victorian prejudice finally fell from Angel's eyes. He saw himself, for the first time, as an arrogant, cold-hearted hypocrite who had crushed a priceless, innocent jewel beneath the iron heel of theoretical idealism. Weak, gaunt, with hollow cheeks and yellowed skin, Angel boarded a slow ship back to England, determined to find his abandoned wife, throw himself at her feet, and beg for her divine forgiveness. When he finally stepped ashore in the familiar green lands of West, he discovered her desperate, weeping letters, waiting for him at his parents' house. A cold shudder of terror pierced his breaking heart when he read the final, despairing words she had written months ago, warning him that her strength was failing and the darkness was closing in. Angel began a frantic, agonizing search, traveling from Marlat to the barren hills of Flintcamash, tracing the tragic footsteps of his lost wife. He finally found her mother, Joan Derbyfield, living in a small, comfortable cottage, funded by an unknown wealthy benefactor. Joan looked upon the ghost of her son with fear and deep reluctance, finally whispering the name of a fashionable seaside resort town. Angel arrived in Sanborn, a modern, glittering city of wealthy pleasures, brightly lit hotels and lavish villas, completely detached from the timeless, earthy rhythm of the countryside. He walked through the paved streets, asking at every grand establishment until he found her name. Registered at a luxurious boarding house called the Herons, he asked the landlady for Mrs. Derber, his heart pounding like a muffled drum. When the parlor door opened, a vision of heartbreaking, tragic beauty appeared before his weeping eyes. Tess stood before him, dressed in an expensive, shimmering silk gown, her dark hair arranged in elegant, fashionable curls, her pale neck adorned with fine lace. Yet, behind this magnificent, wealthy facade, her dark eyes were completely dead, hollow, and devoid of any human spark. Angel dropped to his knees on the carpet, tears pouring down his gaunt face, whispering her name, begging her to take him back, confessing that he was a wretched, blind fool who had learned the true, unconditional meaning of love too late. Tess looked down at his broken form, her lips trembling with unbearable, apocalyptic agony. She stepped back with a dry, hollow voice that sounded like dead autumn leaves, telling him that he was too late. Far too late, she explained, in cold, detached words that she had waited, prayed, and starved until her family was thrown into the dirt, and Alec had convinced her that Angel would never, ever return from across the seas to save her mother and her starving brothers and sisters from total destruction. She had surrendered her body to her tormentor. Angel bowed his head in utter, suffocating despair, realizing that his own cruel pride had driven this magnificent soul into the very mouth of the monster. He turned slowly, walking out into the bright, indifferent morning sun, his legs shaking beneath him like an old, broken man. Inside the lavish upstairs bedroom, Alec d'Urberville lay lazily in his soft, fine bed, laughing with cruel, mocking triumph. He taunted Tess as she entered the room, sneering at the pathetic sight of her starving, ghost-like husband, boasting that no matter what happened, she would always remain his bought possession. A sudden, terrifying stillness descended upon Tess's mind. The long years of quiet suffering, the unbaptized grave of baby sorrow, the freezing rocks of Flint Comet, and the betrayal of her only true love, all fused into a single, blinding flash of absolute, murderous fury. She realized, with crystal clarity, that this single, monstrous man had deliberately poisoned, corrupted, and shattered every single drop of happiness in her innocent life. Downstairs, the landlady of the Herons was sitting peacefully in the breakfast room, enjoying her morning tea. Suddenly, her eyes were drawn to a small, unusual mark, spreading slowly across the white plaster of the ceiling above. She stood up, walking closer to examine the strange spot. It was a dark, wet circle, growing steadily larger, like an ominous, expanding flower. A heavy, dark crimson drop fell from the ceiling, splashing onto the white tablecloth below. It was fresh, warm human blood dripping down from the bedchamber above, announcing to the silent house that the ancient, violent curse of the d'Urberville had claimed its final bloody debt. Chapter 10. The Altar of the Sun. Angel Clare walked slowly down the paved road, away from the glittering seaside town, his heart hollow, and his mind drowned in a gray fog of total despair. The world around him seemed like an empty stage, cold, meaningless, and cruel. Suddenly, the rapid sound of running footsteps echoed on the lonely country lane behind him. He turned around, his tired eyes widening in disbelief, as Tess came running toward him through the morning breeze, her silk dress fluttering wildly, her dark hair undone and falling loosely over her shoulders. She threw herself into his weak arms, gasping for breath, her pale face radiant with a terrifying, ecstatic calm. She looked up into his eyes, holding him tightly, and whispered, with trembling lips, that she had killed Alec d'Urberville, driving a carving knife straight into his heart while he lay upon the bed. She told him, with pure, unfiltered devotion, that she had freed them both from the demon who had poisoned their lives, so that her soul could belong, entirely and forever, to her only true husband. Angel was paralyzed with deep shock and creeping horror, realizing the deadly peril that now surrounded them. Yet, looking into her gentle, wounded eyes, all moral judgment and hesitation vanished from his heart, replaced by an overwhelming, fierce wave of boundless love and protective sorrow. He took her cold, trembling hand in his own, turning away from all towns and public roads, leading her deep into the dense, ancient forests of the New Forest. For several days, the doomed lovers wandered, like two innocent spirits, finding shelter in an empty, decaying mansion hidden among the thick trees. Within those quiet, dusty rooms, closed off from the cruel laws of mankind, they found a few days of pure, unbroken heaven. They sat together by the shuttered windows, holding each other in the soft twilight, speaking in gentle whispers of what might have been, healing their broken souls with tender kisses and unconditional forgiveness. Tess was completely happy, smiling with serene peace, telling Angel that this brief taste of pure love was enough for an entire lifetime, and that she had no fear of what the dark tomorrow might bring. Eventually, the caretaker of the lonely mansion returned, and the lovers were forced to flee once more into the vast, open darkness of the night. They walked for miles across Salisbury Plain, under a cold, starless sky, guided only by the biting, whistling wind. In the middle of the pitch barren expanse, a colossal, shadowy silhouette rose against the horizon. They had arrived, unknowingly, at the ancient, pagan monument of Stonehenge. The towering, mysterious monoliths of stone stood silently, like giant sentinels from a forgotten age, defying the passage of centuries. Tess was completely exhausted, her strength entirely spent, her bare feet bruised and bleeding from the hard, flinty ground. She lay down upon a massive, flat stone slab, the ancient altar of sacrifice, and looked up at the towering pillars above. She asked Angel, with quiet, aching innocence, if he truly believed they would meet again in another, kinder world after death. Angel could not speak. He only turned his face away, weeping bitter, silent tears into the cold darkness, unable to give her a false promise. Tess smiled gently, closed her tired eyes, and fell into a deep, peaceful sleep upon the ancient stone, wrapped warmly in Angel's coat. As the first, faint gray light of dawn began to break over the eastern horizon, the dark, menacing figures of men appeared silently, stepping out from behind the massive stone pillars. A ring of armed police officers and country constables slowly closed in, encircling the ancient altar, their heavy footsteps muffled by the cold grass. Angel stood up, raising his hand in a desperate, pleading gesture, begging the men to remain quiet and let her sleep peacefully for a few final, undisturbed moments. The morning sun rose, casting a pale, golden beam of light directly across Tess's serene, beautiful face. She slowly opened her dark eyes, looked up at the circle of waiting men, and then at Angel Claire. There was no terror in her heart, no weeping, and no regret. She rose gracefully, smoothed her simple dress, and spoke the famous, immortal words with quiet, sublime dignity, "I am ready." A few weeks later, on a cold, gray morning, Angel Claire and Tessa's young sister stood on a high hill overlooking the ancient city of Winter. The bells of the great prison began to toll, a slow, mournful, and heavy sound that echoed across the quiet valley. As the church clocks struck the hour of 8, a large black flag was slowly hoisted up the high flagpole on the prison tower, fluttering darkly against the leaden sky, signaling that the execution was over, and that Tessa's suffering soul had finally found its eternal rest. Angel and Lisa Lou dropped to their knees in the wet grass, bowing their heads in silent, agonizing grief. The long, cruel tragedy had ended. The bitter sport of fate was finished, and the pure, gentle woman of the D'Urbervilles was at peace, forever beyond the reach of human judgment and cruelty. And so, the cold winds of Wessex slowly settle into silence. Tessa's long, sorrowful journey has come to an end, far beyond the reach of human cruelty, false judgment, and the heavy chains of fate. Her pure, unbroken soul has finally found the profound, quiet peace that this world denied her for so long. As the fire crackles softly in our hearth tonight, remember, true nobility is never found in ancient names, gold, or the unforgiving rules of society. It lives quietly within the gentle heart that endures, loves, and remains pure until the very last breath. Thank you for spending this quiet evening with us at Miro's library. Close your eyes, breathe gently, and let the peace of the night embrace you. Good night and sweet dreams.